Hi everyone! So after Diablo 4 Campfire Chat that showed us a lot of the updates coming for Season 4, there is one interesting detail I want to talk about in this video, which is Azurewrath. So we have it on this slide here where they detailed that they're going to update existing designs to have less restrictions. And what they mean is that in general, a lot of the stats and the legendary aspects and the uniques were all like very restricted. They had like certain conditions or multiple conditions at once. And it seems like we're gonna get a lot less of those in the future. And those that exist will be broken down. And one example here is Azurewrath. So especially rogues will be very excited about this item, I think. And I want to break it down a little bit to see what exactly is the impact of this change. So we have this screenshot here from the Campfire Chat. And if you, well, have played before, then you know that Azurewrath is a barbarian only item currently. So it drops from Duriel. And usually you get baited into thinking this is a Doombringer, and well, you get this thing. And for barbarians, this is like an absolutely useless item. Like barbarians have like no synergy whatsoever with freezing enemies, chilling enemies. There's like nothing with like crowd control, synergies, or anything like that. But now that this item is no longer a barbarian only item, you see the new one here on the right, the barbarian only tag is gone, and the stats have been tweaked a little bit. But this makes it suddenly really powerful because now other classes can use it. Now, there are not too many classes that can actually use swords, but there are necromancers and rogues in particular. And I think especially the rogues have the most synergy with this item. So I want to go through some of those existing builds. So I have all my builds here from my planners, for example. This is on my Discord if you're ever looking for any of my planners, by the way. I usually have them all here, and then, you know, there's like more links up there for anything that might be interesting. And I just open them all here, like all the rogue planners right now. And well, there is actually a lot of opportunity to get this Azurewrath into existing builds. Now, of course, there will be other changes. There's a lot of new stuff as well coming with Season 4. So these are not like Season 4 ready planners or something. It's just more of like the general concept of using this weapon on the rogue. And the main reason why why this really excites me is because, well, we have Frigid Finesse in here. This is usually a very powerful passive that gives you up to 30% extra damage when enemies are frozen, which you can quite easily proc with Azurewrath. So that effect alone, as long as you freeze enemies, is usually stronger than even the typical like legendary aspects, and it's just 3 points. And in fact, you can actually have extra ranks to this passive. You can have 6 ranks to Frigid Finesse to get 60% damage bonus with this. This is what people used back in Abattoir of Zir, for example, because there you would actually rely a lot on freezing enemies and then bursting them down in, you know, short bursts before they become unfrozen and unstoppable, or you just straight up kill them in one go. So that's actually what we did back then, for example, with the pension build. And well, 60% damage bonus is a pretty massive multiplier in Diablo 4. And you can get it quite easily from just having this weapon equipped now. Usually it's not that easy to get freezes in rogue builds. So you have a few options for that. You have the Cold Imbue itself, but that is usually a very costly and somewhat unreliable option. It does fit into some builds. For example, I made like a Twisting Blades planner here in Season 3. So when I reworked the build, this actually runs Cold and Shadow together, and actually has this Cold Imbue combo with the Frigid Finesse. You also have stuff like Penitent Greaves to proc Chill, for example, but those boots are not really good enough to actually freeze enemies. It takes forever. I think it's 10% chill per second, and even if you try to invest a little bit into chill effect, there is, for example, a Chilling Weight here for a little bit of chill effect. There's also the Frost Feeder glyph, but it's kind of weak. And in general, it's not that easy to just like chill enemies until you freeze them. Either you freeze them directly through the Cold Imbuement or through multiple hits of Cold Imbuement, or, well, you don't really do much. There's also one extra aspect here, which is Frostbitten. So this says that chilled enemies hit by grenades will be frozen with a chance. So this is usually a very effective tool, but again, you have this condition that enemies have to be chilled first, and then they have to be hit by grenades, and then they can be frozen. So this might be also one of those that might actually get tweaked a little bit in the upcoming updates. We'll see. But it is also something that requires several conditions. Like, for example, you kind of need to have Penitent Greaves in your build to get the chill aura around you. And then you also need to trigger grenades, which is usually done with exposure. There are some aspects for that, but they're mostly unreliable or kind of like low frequency at least. And exposure is kind of like the main way of dropping grenades. And exposure is not really a big thing right now because all of the range builds are in position, and well, the melee builds, they usually go close quarters. So there's like Death Trap build where you can do that. I might even have that in the setup, I'm not sure right now. But it's definitely possible at least to run this combo, but it's also somewhat of a niche choice. So this is really where Azurewrath comes in, and it just straight up gives you the freeze procs, and quite reliably. So if you look at this, 20% chance to freeze enemies with lucky hit is actually not really that bad. Some rogue builds can produce a lot of lucky hits really fast, and you have stuff like shared misery aspect to actually spread that freeze instantly to basically everything around you. And the good thing is that rogues usually don't really struggle too hard to include like another offensive aspect or something in their builds, because you have those extra weapon slots here where, well, you have a lot of offensive slots basically on your gear. And sometimes there's just kind of mediocre choices to put there once you have gotten your main, like, you know, skill specific aspect, like the Blade Dancer on a Twisting Blades build, for example, and then maybe something like Accelerating, or maybe something like Rapid or so for a combo point build. So depending on what exactly you're playing, there are a few good choices, but usually by like aspect number 4 or aspect number 5 or so, the choices are not really that crazy anymore. And this is also another thing where you can just slot in Azurewrath and kind of consider it like an offensive aspect basically, because it can so easily trigger those Frigid Finesse procs. Not only that, but the stats on this item actually seem somewhat decent. It has attack speed, which is always welcome. It has a bunch of stuff like non-physical damage and core damage, which is alright. It has damage to crowd control, which is actually, especially melee rogue specific, useful stat. So as long as this sticks around, I'm not sure, but at least for now, they have not changed close quarters combat, and close quarters combat actually gives you a multiplier for damage versus crowd controlled enemies. So this stat is actually really useful to have on the Azurewrath here. And on top of this, it has this freeze proc with the damage effect. So not only does it freeze enemies, but it also damages them for quite a lot of damage actually. Like an 11.8k base damage proc is actually pretty high. And they did mention that all these flat value procs are actually going to scale in the future with new weapon damage. So I'm not sure if this is already like a new updated value here, but it definitely seems higher than before. And 11.8k is a relatively high value if you compare this to other existing procs that we have. For example, X-Files Ring or so has like a relatively high value. We have this here, it goes up to like 40k or so. So one Azurewrath proc might be something like a quarter of an X-File proc. And that is actually pretty good. Like I remember back in Season 2 when I was trying X-Files Ring a lot, on a rogue, I was sometimes critting for like 4 or 5 million or something with this ring. So this means that Azurewrath could probably even proc into 1 million or something, or even more in the future. Now there's obviously also some other synergies, especially in the Paragon board. So if you look at this here, for example, one Paragon board I generally like a lot on Rogue is the Cheap Shot board. You have this up to 25% damage multiplier here for crowd controlling nearby enemies. And depending on the build, this is not that easy to achieve. Yeah, okay, you have Puncture, for example, but if you just puncture into 1 or 2 targets, you don't really spread this enough. You can have stuff like Shared Misery in there and then maybe spread the slow from the puncture or so. Or you have like, for example, the Twisting Blades of the Days. So this is kind of like a decent option. But again, you need stuff like Shared Misery to really make this work. But with Azurewrath, even without adding something like a Shared Misery aspect, you might actually kind of get away with it and have an extra damage boost from Cheap Shot as well. So there's that. And there's also the Control Glyph. It's also right here, actually, which buffs your damage against slowed and chilled or stunned and frozen targets, and also gives you this damage to crowd control enemies. So again, all of the melee rogue builds actually run this because of the close quarters combat right now. But in addition to that, usually you have kind of trouble really proccing this extra additional bonus damage. So especially this 20% bonus, where you have to stun or freeze enemies, was somewhat inconsistent, and there was not really that many good ways of proccing it. And this is also where Azurewrath comes in. If you can just like walk into a pack and insta-freeze everything, it's going to be a pretty massive damage boost from this glyph alone. Another interesting perk here is also that with this extra freeze, you can actually stagger bosses really fast. So especially with the pit coming in, where we have these boss fights at the end that will probably last quite a while, they might actually be able to set up these insane burst combos to actually just completely decimate these bosses when they are staggered. This is what we used to do, for example, back in Season 0 and Season 1 with Uberlolith. People usually played like a Poison Twisting Blades build, and you waited until the boss was staggered, and then you have, you know, Frigid Finesse kicking in, you know, other aspects kicking in that just give you extra damage against stunned enemies or so. And well, suddenly it would just melt the boss, because the boss was stationary, and you stand in your Bursting Venoms pools, and you get all these extra damage modifiers, and suddenly, you know, you're just gonna decimate. So I think also this is gonna be another huge purpose here for Azurewrath, for these like high lucky hit builds, to just kind of like proc freezes over and over until the boss is staggered. And that thing alone, together with, for example, the daze from a Twisting Blade and maybe the slow from the puncture, can actually stagger bosses really fast. Because the more different types of crowd control you stack, the faster you stagger bosses. Basically try to like spread it out between different types of crowd controls. And adding in a direct freeze proc is going to be very beneficial for that. So this is just some stuff that I wanted to discuss about the Azurewrath in particular. I think it's just a very interesting option now that it's open to all classes. There may also be some other use cases on a Necromancer, which can also use swords, but most of the time they're somewhat starved for legendary aspects, so I'm not too sure if that's gonna be a thing. But who knows, maybe. I think they also have something like the control glyph and maybe some other crowd control synergies with freeze. But I think it's mostly going to be a rogue weapon going forward. I don't think that Barbs really would ever look at Azurewrath in any serious way. And probably for the Necros, it's just like too hard to fit in there. But I think for rogues, this is exactly right. So I'm very excited for this weapon and try out. And personally, I just really love freezing enemies. I think, like, you know, freezing stuff, it just feels good in Diablo 4. And every time I play with Cold Imbuement, for example, on my Twisting Blades build or so, it just feels amazing, and I'm very much looking forward to trying out the Azurewrath on a lot of different rogue builds. So I think there's a lot of opportunities here in not just the melee builds, but even the ranged builds. It's a lucky hit proc that procs on anything, not just when you use core skills. It's like on any skill, on melee, on range, whatever. You can proc it, for example, with Penetrating Shot very easily. You can just like shoot into a pack, and for example, instead of Icy Alchemist aspect that a lot of people are using this season, which we might have here actually. So this is like, you know, one way where you shoot Shadow Imbuement, and then you have the Icy Alchemist proccing those chill explosions. Now you could, for example, replace the Icy Alchemist and still have the freezes from Azurewrath, because you get this lucky hit effect, and you don't actually need to have Shadow Imbuement even anymore. So you can probably play like a full, like physical, no imbuement version that still freezes enemies, for example. So there's definitely some options like that. It's going to be quite exciting to see what we can make work here. I'm going to cover more stuff about the PTR, and especially once they have the patch notes, there's going to be a lot of stuff to discuss. So I'm just looking forward to doing a lot of theory crafting, a lot of testing when the PTR actually comes. So stay tuned for a lot of that. Here also on the right, we have this grenade stuff that I'm very excited for as well. I definitely want to make a grenade rogue work. I do have some ideas for this already that I want to discuss soon. So you can also stay tuned for that. And well, let's just see what comes out of this. Personally, I'm very much looking forward to Season 4 and everything that comes of it. And there are still, you know, some, you know, loose ends to be tied up with some of the designs. And, you know, we're expecting more patches in the future that will fix some of the holes that we can already see, basically. But in the grand scheme of things, Season 4 is going to be great, I think. And, well, not just for rogues, but for all classes. It's going to be a lot of exciting stuff that I want to try. So, let's see. Hope you liked this video here. Let me know what you think. And see you guys next time.